Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video.
Good morning, everyone. It's 11 o'clock. We're going to get started. Thank you for joining us. This week we're talking about managing invasive plants. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. Our presenter today is our environmental educator, Natalie Walker.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome for attending the Managing Invasive Plants presentation. So an invasive plant species defined by the United States Forest Service is a non-native or alien to the ecosystem under consideration and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So just to have some different definitions of native species, non-native species, and invasive species. Native species occur naturally without human intervention. They were on North America prior to European settlement, and native species have natural checks, balances for growth. Non-native species are introduced. They've been introduced to an area by people from other continents, states, ecosystems, and habitats. Many non-native species, though, have economic value for agriculture, forestry, and horticulture, and usually pose little or no threat to natural ecosystems. However, other non-natives have become invasive and pose a serious ecological threat. Invasive species reproduce rapidly. They can spread over large areas of landscape, and they have few, if any, natural controls to keep them checked and balanced. So why are invasive plants successful? Many invasive plants produce large quantities of seeds. They spread aggressively by runners or rhizomes, which are horizontal underground stems. They have few or no natural predators or diseases to keep them in check outside their native range. And many invasive plant seeds are often distributed by birds and other animals and wind. So like birds can consume the fruit and deposit the seeds and transport seeds on their feet and fur. People can also help the spread of invasive plants when they carry the seeds and other parts of the plant on their shoes, clothing, and equipment. And many invasive aquatic plants are spread when the plant parts are attached to boat anchors and propellers. And garlic mustard is allelopathic, meaning that it produces chemicals in the leaves and the root system, which inhibits the growth of other plants around them. So this top left picture, this picture is actually taken in Quechee, Vermont, which is where I did my internship in 2010. And as an intern, we went around in canoes and just pulled Eurasian water milfoil for hours and hours and collected in the canoe. And my supervisor during my internship, he moved from Vermont to Maine, but he actually comes back every year to help keep the water milfoil under control. And there's a dog with some seeds on its head, and then the boat with parts of the invasive plant attached to the motor. So some of the negative impacts of invasive plant species, they can displace native plants, which include rare species, and invasive plants reduce food and shelter for native wildlife. They can become a monoculture, which have little ecological value and greatly reduce the biological diversity of an area. They can impact recreational activities in natural areas such as boating, bird watching, and fishing. Some invasives are so thick that it's impossible to access forests and waterways in other areas. And according to the terrestrial invasive plants of the Potomac River watershed, removal of invasive plants is an enormous amount of time and labor, and invasive plant control can cost over 120 billion annually in damage and control. And invasive plants have been referred to as a form of biological pollution, meaning they're a threat to the environment, such as the tree on the right, which is being choked by English ivy, which you probably see driving around in Northern Virginia. So the vines of English ivy, they climb up the tree slowly, killing the tree from the base upwards by taking over the branches, the twigs. They block sunlight and eventual tree death. And the added weight of the vines can also make the tree susceptible to blowing over during a storm. So you can help fight invasive plant species in your area. So become familiar with invasive plant species in your area. There's a lot of great websites and resources to ID invasive plants in our area. When selecting plants for your landscape, make sure to avoid using invasive species and any species that exhibit invasive qualities. When you go to your nursery, ask for native plants and bring a list with you so it can help you shop for native plants. Make sure to do your research, and when you go to the nurseries, know what native plants they sell. And if the local garden center has invasive plants, don't buy them. If you have aquarium or house plants, don't dump them in the environment because they can end up in the lakes, streams, rivers, ponds, and other natural areas. So if you already have invasive plants on your property, consider removing them and replacing them with native species. There's a really great video given by Nancy Berlin, the natural resource specialist at the Prince William Extension Office, and it's called What to Plant After Removing Invasive Plants. Spread the word and not the weed. So when you are at a family gathering or with your friends, let them know and tell them not to purchase or plant invasive species. And avoid carrying those hitchhikers after a walk in the woods by taking time to brush the seeds from your clothing and shoes and your dogs. So I visited Michigan, natural or park in Michigan last week, and I had to take a picture of the sign. So at the entrance, they have a little, it's called a boot brush. So before you go in, you can use the boot brush to take any material off your boots, and then you want to use it after you leave the park to get any seeds off your boots. So if you have some time, you can volunteer at local parks and natural areas. There's a lot of local groups that have year-round volunteer work parties to remove invasive plants. And it's actually really rewarding work and a healthy form of outdoor exercise. So chemicals are often necessary to manage and eradicate invasive plants. So chemical management techniques will be presented in this session, but no specific recommendations will be provided to a client without a sample or photo and information about the site where the plant is located. And you always want to make sure to ID the plants before applying chemicals. And if you think you have an invasive plant on your property, the Master Gardener Horticulture Help Desk can help with that. You can send in a picture of the plant to mastergardener@pwcgov.org. Some pesticide safety. Remember that all pesticides are poison, so you want to use with care. Always read and follow all label instructions, especially when it comes to how to use it, where to use it, what you can use it on, what personal protective equipment you need to wear, how to safely store and dispose of it. And remember that the label is the law, and we want to make sure to protect the environment, yourself, and others around you. So if you have some invasives in your backyard, these are some tips for getting started. Like I said, you want to make sure you ID the invasive plant correctly because there are lookalikes which can be native. There are many great resources on invasive plants in our area to help you, and I'll show some of those resources at the end of the presentation. Don't feel like you must remove them all at once. It can be overwhelming, definitely, but removing and replacing invasive plant as your time and budget allow, and every little bit helps. You want to become familiar with invasive plant species on your property and take action when the plants are young, which is before they spread and set seed. You want to have a plan to revegetate ahead of time to prevent erosion and re-entry of invasive plants. You're going to have to plan to monitor frequently. You want to be persistent and committed to the process once you start, which can take 5+ years. Pull, cut, or treat when seeds are absent. Be thorough about sanitation disposal after removal of the invasive plants. You want to disturb the soil as little as possible because the more seeds that are disturbed come to the top and have access to light and moisture. Conduct manual activities when the soil is moist to aid in removal of the roots. And if you decide to hire a professional applicator, monitor their work and ask what techniques and herbicides they're using. And definitely read and obey herbicide labels carefully. Protect yourself, others, and the environment. So the plan of attack, there's 3 broad categories, which covers most invasive plant control. Today we're going to be talking mostly about mechanical and chemical. There is a biological control, but several criteria must be met for a biocontrol agent to be approved for release. And as of right now, only the mile-a-minute beetle is available as a biocontrol for any of the Blue Ridge Prism's Terrible 12 invasives. And Penn State and Virginia Tech are studying a naturally occurring fungal wilt of Tree of Heaven as a feasible biological control agent. And sometimes an invasive plant, it might take mechanical and chemical, or it might be able to be hand pulled. So several techniques can be used in controlling a single species, but usually there's one preferred method, and that's to have minimal impact on non-target species in the environment. So mechanical, these are treatments. These are usually the first ones to look at when evaluating an invasive plant removal project. The nice thing is they don't require special licensing or introduce chemicals into the environment. So hand pulling and digging, many herbaceous plants and some woody species up to 1 inch in diameter can be pulled out or dug up. You want to remove as much of the root system as possible. So even a small portion that's left over can restart the infestation. Pull plants by hand or using a digging fork. Shovels can shear off portions of the root system, which can allow for regrowth. Make sure to bag and remove all pieces, as most invasive plants can reestablish from small pieces left behind. If you have something that's about 3 inches in diameter, you can use a weed wrench, a root jack, or root talon. These tools, they're designed to remove the above ground portion of the plant as well as the entire root system. And it's easiest to undertake this type of control in the early spring or summer when the soil is moist, and then plants come out more easily. So on the left is an example of a weed wrench. I've used that tool to remove rows of Sharon, and I actually really like that tool. It helps out a lot to get the roots out. And on the right is a root jack, and it's a tool shaped like a pickaxe, and it grips onto the plant stems and pulls them out of the ground. Another mechanical option is covering plants with sheet barriers. These are techniques that provide a surface cover designed to kill existing vegetation under it and to eliminate the seed bank of undesirable plants. So on the left is sheet mulching, where you mow or weed whip low to the ground, removing as much vegetation as possible. You can use cardboard, making sure to remove all the tape on the cardboard, or newspaper. You want to use 10 to 15 layers of overlapping newspaper or cardboard, saturating it with water. And you can secure the area with rocks and cover 4 to 6 months and monitor for any holes. And on the right is a process called solarizing. It uses moisture and heat to control weeds by using plastic sheeting to capture radiant energy from the sun. Another mechanical option is using pruners, loppers, shears, and saws, bush cutters, string trimmers, chainsaws, or stump grinding. These are techniques designed to remove plant tissue above the ground, which exhausts the plant resources and ultimately prevents the resprouting. And just to highlight, bladed hand tools, they're very effective at cutting vegetation, but they can also be hazardous without proper training. So make sure you exercise caution if you're going to control plants by cutting with these tools. So goats are another mechanical option. They control plants at a plant community scale. So goats will usually eat anything if they're hungry enough, but they can be grazed to clear invasive plants, but they must be carefully trained and managed, so they eat the invasives first and move on to another site before they begin eating desirable plants. There's different factors. They graze depending on the breed of goat and how hungry they are. They'll go for Japanese honeysuckle and multiflora rose first in a given situation because they're high in protein plants. And goats, they don't eat the plant roots, so resprouts of the woody plants they graze are likely. Another mechanical option is cutting, weed whacking, or mowing. This technique is best used for locations that you can visit and treat often. And to be effective, you'll need to mow or cut infested areas 3 or 4 times a year for up to 5 years. And the goal is to interrupt the plant's ability to photosynthesize by removing as much of the leafy material as possible. So all the repeated mowing will eventually exhaust the plant reserves and the plant will die. And just to keep in mind, this can take many years. So you have to remain committed to the process once you start. And in this picture, this gentleman's using a weed whacker fitted with a steel blade, and he's cutting through Japanese honeysuckle vines that are smothering a small tree. So I found this really great resource from California Invasive Plant Council. It's called Best Management Practices for Non-Chemical Weed Control. And this manual is available as free for download. And a lot of the mechanical information I shared on the previous slides comes from this manual, and the contents include removing whole plants, and there's techniques for each table of contents. There's controlling plants by cutting, controlling plants in place, covering plants with sheet barriers, controlling plants at a plant community scale, and then biological controls. And this manual also, it shows you how to use the techniques, caveats, potential hazards to humans, environment, and cultural resources, when not to use that technique, and it has some really great photos. So after you've pulled all those invasives, what do you do next? You can dry and cook the invasive plant. You can place it on your driveway or any asphalt surface and let it dry out for a month. And then place that dead material in a doubled up trash bag and let it cook in the sun for 1 more month. And at the end of the month, the material should be non-viable and you can dump it or dispose it with the trash. And this dry cook method assumes that there's no viable seed mixed in with the removed material. You can chip and compost it, use it as a mulch on site or add to compost once fully dead and dried. And you don't want to compost any invasives unless you know there's no living plant material left. You can also burn it, make a brush pile and burn the materials following local safety regulations and restrictions and, of course, local weather conditions. And you can use the firewood locally and make sure not to move the firewood. So next we'll talk about chemical controls or management. So how you apply the herbicide depends upon what invasives you're treating, how bad the infestations are, and the time of year you're working. So herbicides can be applied in several ways. There's the foliar spray, which is sprayed onto the green leaves. The bottom left picture is a gentleman using a backpack sprayer, and you can spot spray or on like smaller, if there's not too many invasive plants. And then there's also broadcast, which is spraying on large infestations. There's the wick sponge method, which is wiped onto green leaves. And this eliminates the possibility of spray drifting onto non-target plants. And that's the second picture from the left. Then there's the cut stump method, which is sprayed or painted onto stem or trunk. And the third picture in, painting or spraying concentrated herbicide onto the outer edge of a cut stump kills the root system and prevents resprouting. The fourth picture in is basil bark. It's sprayed or painted onto the lower trunk. And the herbicide is concentrated to the lower 6 to 12 inches of the trunk. And the last method, the picture on the very right, is the hack and squirt, which is the herbicide is squirted into the cuts in the trunk. So it's easy to kill invasive trees by hacking into the bark and then spraying the herbicide into those cuts. So we're going to talk about PRISM, their terrible 12s. And PRISM stands for the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. This list on the right, it's not all inclusive. There's so many more non-native invasive plants that I could talk about for days and days. We just don't have time for it. So Blue Ridge PRISM collaborated with the Virginia Department of Forestry to develop an easy-to-use chart of best practices and recommended herbicides for the terrible 12 invasive plants. These herbicides are ones that have the least impact on the surrounding environment compared to other choices. In addition, the suggested control methods are the most benign approved by the U.S. Forest Service. And the Virginia Department of Forestry chart is titled Non-Native Invasive Plant Species Control and Treatments, and this can be downloaded for free from their PRISM website. So today we're going to be talking about grasses, herbs, forbs, vines, shrubs, and trees that are all invasive and on the terrible 12s. So like I said, Blue Ridge PRISM is the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. It's a really, really great resource. Their mission is to lessen the negative impact of invasive species on both private and public lands within 10 counties in Virginia's northern Blue Ridge region. That includes Clark, Warren, Rappahannock, Page, Madison, Greene, Albemarle, Nelson, Augusta, and Rockingham counties. And they're a registered 501c3. They have upcoming summer invasive plant workshops and free quarterly meetings, which anyone can attend. They have books and web resources on invasive plants and native plant books, and they have alerts. They have an alerts page on different invasive species. So first we'll start with Japanese stiltgrass. So there are manual and mechanical ways to control Japanese stiltgrass. You can hand pull small infestations before plants set seeds. It's effective but labor intensive. They're easy to pull from the soil when the soil's moist, and consider hand weeding around desirable native plants before applying any herbicides. So these chemical recommendations were taken from the Home Grounds and Animals Pest Management Guide that we use here at the office. So chemical controls, you can use a crabgrass pre-emergent to control Japanese stiltgrass. Stiltgrass, it does germinate early in the spring, several weeks before crabgrass. So the chemicals can be applied beginning late February, but remember that reapplication may be necessary. Post-emergent, it's effective when the plants are young, and repeated applications may be necessary for larger plants. And glyphosate is also an option, but remember that it can harm turf and other desirable plants as well. And some of the products I listed above can't be used in our waterways, including small streams and wetlands, and remember to read the label. So Japanese stiltgrass can produce a large number of seeds, from 16,000 to 50,000 seeds per square meter. Stiltgrass control will require multiple attempts and strategies. And due to the amount of seeds they produce, removal of stiltgrass infestations may take a few years to fully remove the problem. All right, next on the list is wavy leaf grass or wavy leaf basket grass. Manual and mechanical ways to remove it is hand pulling if populations are small, but remember that all bits and pieces of the stolons must be removed or they will resprout. And hand pulling is ineffective in large areas of infestation. And if you see wavy leaf basket grass, don't walk through it. You can inadvertently collect seeds on yourself or your dog, and you can use duct tape to remove seeds from clothing and comb the seeds from the dog's fur. Next on the list is garlic mustard. There are manual and mechanical controls. It's hard to pull garlic mustard in a heavily infested area, but it can work for scattered plants of small groups. These are easy to pull from the soil, but when you pull from the soil, make sure you tamp down the soil to avoid bringing seeds to the surface. Oh, and I forgot to mention on the other slides, this chart at the top is from Virginia Department of Forestry. So they have control timing, control method. They list manual, mechanical, and foliar spray, the herbicide rates, and any notes to include with each invasive species. So on the right, there's a picture of garlic mustard. And on the left, this was during my internship in Vermont, where all the interns were pulling garlic mustard. So 24 bags later, we only made a dent in the garlic mustard infestation, and that's me in my blue bandana. All right, next is Japanese honeysuckle. There's manual and mechanical. You can hand pull when the honeysuckle is young and in small areas, but any roots left in the soil will re-sprout. Where the vine climbs the tree in a forest and also runs on the ground, pull up the crown, which weakens the runners on the ground, but a foliar spray is still needed to kill the plant. Next is porcelain-berry. You can hand pull on young plants. With larger plants, pulling doesn't remove the entire root system, and it's nearly impossible to dig up the taproot of an established porcelain-berry. Oriental bittersweet. You can destroy small bittersweet vines by hand pulling, but be sure to remove the crown and all large roots. Do not pull the vines from the tree. It's hazardous to people on the ground and can harm the tree. And on the bottom left, you can see that the bark of mature bittersweet has raised netted pattern that makes it easy to identify. Next, there's myelominate, manual and mechanical control. You want to do this before they set seed, and any plants that you pull that has fruit should be bagged and discarded. You can also repeatedly weed whack vines as close to the ground as possible, but you want to be careful not to injure any woody plants that it's growing on. And I'd recommend wearing long gloves if you decide to pull this, because I pulled it one time and I had short gloves on, but my inner arms were totally like torn up from pulling the myelominate. Next is kudzu. Mechanical cutting, you can use machetes or mowers if feasible. You want to repeat this weekly throughout the growing season for 3 to 4 years to exhaust the tubers. Mowing doesn't destroy the crowns, which can re-sprout. If you ever sever crowns from both the vines sprouting from the crowns and from the tubers beneath the crowns, then you will effectively kill the kudzu. Multiflora rose. You can pull individual plants. Shrubby plants from the soil works only if all roots are removed. One technique to avoid the thorns is to stomp on the canes near the crown, bending them downwards and away from your face and body. You can use long handled pruners or handheld clippers to cut every cane about a foot or less from the ground. And sometimes having a second person can be helpful by keeping the canes and bending them away from you. And a weed whacker with a metal disc also works well in cutting through thickets. Autumn olive, it's really recognizable. It has silvery leaves on the underside. I saw a lot of these when I was traveling through Michigan. They can be if they're young, they can be hand pulled or dug up if the population's not excessive. Digging larger plants, it can be problematic because they can re-sprout from any roots left behind. Repeatedly cutting back established shrubs to the ground level without applying herbicides will not control autumn olive because stems regrow thicker and denser than before. You can use tools such as the weed wrench or root talon, which offer more leverage than a shovel, which allows removal of the plants with stems up to the 3-inch across. In low quality, heavily invaded fields, you can pull large autumn olive shrubs with a chain or a tractor bucket. You want to treat resprouts with herbicide. Regular repeat mowing can prevent seedlings from establishing. Chinese privet. Large shrubs can be dug out with a mattock or pulled out with a weed wrench, but resprouting is likely. It makes these methods labor intensive and not highly effective. You can cut down thickets with a chainsaw or brush cutter, and it may take several years to weaken the invasive shrub. Extensive infestations of mature tall shrubs in open areas may call for a forest mulcher, which can grind huge plants to ground level quickly and efficiently. Tree of Heaven, Ailanthus, Paradise Tree. You can hand pull seedlings when the soil is moist, remove all the roots. Suckers resemble seedlings, but are attached to large roots and break if pulled, leaving an aggressively resprouting root system. You can use a foliar spray on the Tree of Heaven. So here are some resources I used for the presentation. I really enjoyed the Plant Invaders of the Mid-Atlantic Natural Area. I have the booklet, but it's available for free online. There's the Blue Ridge PRISM website, which has a lot of great material. The Best Management Practices for Non-Chemical Weed Control from California. The Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation has a lot of information on invasive plants and native plants. There's this Terrestrial Invasive Plants of the Potomac River Watershed. That brochure is available online. And then there's the Virginia Invasive Species Working Group, and that's also a good website that's comes in handy. So if you have something you're not sure about, such as plants, insects, or you want control recommendations, you can email the Extension Horticultural Help Desk at mastergardener@pwcgov.org. We can help with identification, management, plant recommendations, such as ground covers, trees, shrubs, etc. Virginia Cooperative Extension Prince William also has a YouTube page. So all of our Wednesday classes are recorded and uploaded to our YouTube page. We also have upcoming Wednesday Zoom classes, which are all online from 11 to noon. The next one is June 16th, Ask a Master Gardener. June 23rd is Greenhouses for Beginners, and June 30th is Problem Areas in Your Landscape. These classes are free, but just make sure to register for these classes. We also have Saturday in the Garden, which is at 9535 Linton Hall Road in Bristow, Virginia. These classes are also free and they're outdoors. Registration is required and they go from 9 a.m. to noon. So the next one is July 10th on growing and identifying mushrooms. August 7th is cut flowers. September 4th is cover crops, Hugel Garden fall plant sale. And October 3rd is on permaculture and yoga. So if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box. The link to this presentation will be sent to all participants, which will include a short evaluation. And please help us by completing the evaluation so that we can improve our services. And I hope you learned about some invasives, and thank you for joining us. And I hope you come out to the teaching garden and participate in our next upcoming Wednesday classes.
Okay, Natalie, we had a couple of questions. We've answered some of them.
Okay.
In the chat box.
Christina, can you speak up just a little bit more?
Oh, sure. Sorry. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yep, better.
Okay, sorry. I have my microphone away from my mouth a little bit. We have questions in the chat box. We did answer some of them. The one question was, is Rose of Sharon considered invasive? I responded to that it is in Northern Virginia. There's a Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia actually has on their website a good article about this and some alternatives to that. I think Thomas answered the one, Thomas or Linda answered the one about the Japanese knotweed using glyphosate for that.
Yeah, I'd have to do more research on knotweed. I actually, when I was in Vermont, I think I pulled that too. It was so long ago, I don't remember, but I know it's invasive, but I'd have to do more research on like control methods for knotweed.
The next one is, what is meant by crown on vines, the top? If so, how does it survive from after cutting the base?
Could you repeat that again?
Yes. What is meant by crown on vines, the top? If so, how does it survive after cutting the base?
I mean, they're saying that any part that falls, that's left behind can resprout. So that's what I'm getting from the question. I don't know if I'm...
Part of it is that depending on the vine, with some vines you can cut them off at, you can cut the top off and you reduce their photosynthetic ability, and so they have to draw on their root reserves to put up more leaves. And if you keep cutting them, eventually it will exhaust those roots and it will kill it. Most plants can resprout from their roots, particularly our invasive perennials. There are some plants that you want to cut both the stem off and the root off from the crown because they won't resprout without a crown.
Hi, I'm the person who posted that. Is it okay for me to just chime in and try and clarify
Sure.
my question? Okay, thanks. So a couple of times you said that the crown will resprout. And I would think that the crown of a vine is like the crown of a tree, which is the top. And if you've cut all of the stems that go into the ground that connect to the roots, I'm not clear on how that crown by itself could resprout.
I mean, I'm guessing if the crown has like flowers on it or berries and it falls onto the ground, it could resprout.
Oh, that's just, the next generation. But I thought you meant like it sends roots down into the ground. That's what it sounded like.
Oh,
So
sorry.
There are some vines, and I don't think that any of the vines that Natalie talked about are included in this, but there are some vines that if you cut them off and if it's humid enough, they will produce air roots that will allow them to grow. But basically, if you separate the top, it's not going to reproduce.
Okay.
The top isn't.
Thanks.
Let's see.
There was a question about fruits and vegetables, I think.
Yeah. Are there any fruit and vegetable plants that would be considered invasive?
Not that I know of. I've never heard of any being invasive.
It kind of depends on what you're talking about in terms of vegetables. I don't think so. Well, technically, I guess garlic mustard, because it is part of the mustard family. Fruit-wise, I don't think there are any trees that are considered invasive because it takes so long for fruit trees to get established. But I can't think of really anything that's too terribly invasive, because most of the time we're harvesting it.
And then says you skip by there. You didn't mention, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Salandine, which has taken over.
Oh, lesser Salandine. Yeah, there's so many. I just took the terrible 12s from the PRISM's list. I mean, like I said, there's so many invasives that I could talk about, which would take days and days. So I only included the top 12. But yeah, I've heard of the lesser Celandine.
Wendy pointed out that mulberries are invasive, and to clarify that, there is a native variety of mulberry, which is therefore not invasive. But there are two species that are non-native, and those don't get planted very often. A lot of people consider the native mulberry invasive just because it's a very prolific tree. But the black mulberry, which is the native one, is not invasive. The red and the white are the invasive ones. Thank you, Wendy.
And Maggie had mint with a question mark on it.
Yeah, mint is, well, first of all, there are lots of mints. A lot of things we don't consider mints that are in that family. And yeah, mints can be invasive. Most of the time, mints are kept in general control, but you don't see, for example, mint taking over.
Yeah, I would say they're like more aggressive than invasive.
Why are nurseries allowed to sell invasives?
Good question.
It's a very good question, one that I don't think we have an answer for.
Is there not a bill that they're trying to get in?
I think there is, but I don't know. I don't remember the name of it.
Yeah, I thought I read something.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and there's some, quote, invasives, not really the ones that are on this list, but there's some invasive trees, for example, which if you manage them correctly, they won't be invasive. And there are other trees that are so prolific that people may think they're invasive, but really are native. Are there any other questions? Oh, thank you, Susan. Delaware just passed a bill prohibiting the sale of invasives. Hopefully that will be copied around the country.
I thought I read something that Maryland also just passed one, just in the last few weeks.
I know Maryland's been discussing it, but I didn't know they had passed it.
I thought I saw that they passed it. I have to look it up. Would you know the type of mint nurseries sell? I see labels that label it as mint, and that is all.
That's kind of annoying sometimes. Most of the, quote, mint that's being sold is usually either spearmint or peppermint. And the more exotic mints like chocolate mint, pineapple mint, those tend to be labeled as such. Some of the more weedy mints, they tend not to sell. But generally, if you get something that's labeled just mint, it's probably spearmint or peppermint.
I know when I was just at, I was looking around Lowe's, they now have the chocolate mint and pineapple mint labeled as foodie something for, I guess it's their new advertising technique to sell it for, you know, cooking classes and stuff like that.
Yeah, and mints are fine to plant. We just recommend that you plant them in a container where they can't get out of control.
So Cher says she knows she missed some due to a bad connection, but for a long time she thought invasive plants were just aggressive in their growth patterns. But what's the difference?
I'll go back to this slide. So non-native species, they've been introduced, but they pose little or no threat to natural ecosystems. But on the other hand, there's the invasive species, which reproduce rapidly. They can spread over large areas, and they have few, if any, natural controls. There are non-native species. Usually they pose little or no natural threat, but there are some that have become invasive and pose a serious ecological threat. Yeah, and there's also some native species that are considered aggressive. So
yeah, like for example, a non-native species that's not considered a problem in most situations is like white clover. A lot of our vegetables that have come from different countries are not considered invasive. That would be kind of the difference, as opposed to something that will go crazy and take up everything. Let's see, what else do we have? Wendy asked about bittercress. What would you like to know about bittercress, Wendy? Bittercress, for those of you who don't know, is a cool season weed. It tends to start growing in late fall or late winter, depending on when the seeds decide they want to germinate, and they will go from, once they get going in the spring, the time from sprouting to flowering and dropping seed is very quick. And also when their seeds are mature, all you have to do is walk through them, and the seed pods will literally explode seeds everywhere. So that's pretty invasive in my point of view. But if you have thick, high-cut turf, usually that's not a problem. Let's see. Laurel mentioned that non-natives also can offer no food source. That's true of a lot of non-natives. Mm-hmm. They are not good food sources for wildlife. Brown-eyed Susans are native and very aggressive. That's true. Is HBC considered invasive? I don't know what HBC is. Wendy, if you could clarify what that is, we can answer that. Let's see, somebody has said non-native is somewhat misleading. Non-native species, all our invasives are non-native species, but we tend to break them into just non-native introduced species. and invasives. Invasives are a subclass of non-native species. Let's see, are red clover okay? Are red clovers okay? Red clover, so true red clover is actually a little bit purple. It's fine. It actually is putting nitrogen into the soil. They only last about 5 years. They tend to be considered beneficial. Of course, if somebody gets a little careless with how they plant them, they can spread by water, or they can spread on the wind, depending on how they apply them and when they apply them. There's also crimson clover, which is actually a bright red clover, which is an annual. It's a more upright clover. Both of those are considered okay. Neither poses a big threat. Generally, red clover is going to spread when the conditions are good for it. So the red clover must really like where they got planted. Yeah, the purple-looking one shares noted in the chat that the purple-looking ones were the type of clover she was asking about. Yeah, those are red clover. Why they're called red clover instead of purple clover, I have no idea. But do we have any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Natalie, for presenting.
Thank you.
Next week, we're going to have basically a big question and answer session, Ask a Master Gardener. So come with questions you might have about your lawn, landscape, or garden, and we will answer those questions in an open forum. Again, thank you all for attending, and we'll see you next week. If you're interested in lawn care, please contact our Best Lawns Coordinator, Natalie Walker, at nwalker@pwcgov.org. If you enjoyed this video, please let us know with your questions, comments, and suggestions for other classes and videos. We can be reached at mastergardener@pwcgov.org. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.